Load shedding is back. For a lot of South Africa. Oh, bother. Just kidding, they can't turn the sun off. Yet. Anyway. For a lot of South Africans, the news of another batch of load shedding brings a mixture of frustration, despair, and dark humour. For those who live in more stable power grids, the whole thing can be a little bit confusing. So I thought I'd go through the details quickly, because it actually is interesting and a bit of a cautionary tale for those currently in a populist climate. So let's start with what load shedding actually is. The power load, or demand, in South Africa is roughly 30,000 megawatts. This fluctuates widely based on a lot of factors like the time of day, the day of week, the weather outside, and so on. But 30,000 is a good estimate for the average peak load. The supply also fluctuates widely, but a good estimated average is around 32,000 to 34,000 megawatts. You might be able to see the problem there. That's a 2,000 to 4,000 megawatt gap between supply and demand, and it doesn't take much generation failure for that gap to be lost. If the demand exceeds the supply, it can lead to parts of the grid tripping or turning off, and that can make the problem worse, which cascades into more tripping. The cascades can continue until the entire grid is down, and that is a disaster. You see, once a power plant is down, it can take days, if not weeks, to get it fired up again, and then synced with the grid. The grid needs to be stable, so only one can really be done at a time, so it could take months for most of the grid to return from a full blackout. Months without power are how economies are destroyed. It would end South Africa as we know it. So, enter load shedding. When it looks like the supply is going to dip below the demand, a rolling blackout to chunks of the grid is implemented. Basically, bits of it are turned off for 2 to 3 hours at a time to keep the demand lowered. Each level of load shedding is 1,000 megawatts of the grid being turned off. We went up to level 6 over the weekend, so that's 6,000 megawatts worth of bits of South Africa being off. So why is it broken, and why is that so significant? Eskom was one of the best power generation companies in the world between 2000 and 2010. It made power reliably and cheaply. It did have a few advantages. It's mostly coal-powered, and there are some excellent coal mines pouring out good quality coal within the regions. So it wasn't like we had to import fuel. So what happened? How did we get from best in the world to load shedding? Well, one of the starting points is a bit of a sensitive topic, so I need to explain it carefully. South Africa has had a very bad past in terms of minority rule and strongly racist social mechanisms. Slavery, legally anyway, ended in the early 1800s, but was replaced by all of the horrors of apartheid. Just before 2000, there was a major socio-political upheaval, and elections were finally mostly fair. Unfortunately, this led to a populist rule based on things like resolving racial conflicts rather than country-running competence. But that's a bigger and very complicated topic. Specifically to Eskom, the state-owned South African power generation company, it came with a storm of affirmative action. Basically, all senior and executive positions, both managerial and technical, were staffed by white people. The new government of SA required that all state-owned companies and all companies that wanted to do business with the state needed to have a representative staff, i.e. one that had the same racial demographic as the country as a whole. Which was obviously fair. The problem was that Eskom heavily relied on a system of experience and mentorship to keep running smoothly. There was massive pressure on the existing experienced staff to leave so that they could be replaced by non-white staff. The new staff were likely entirely capable. The problem was that they simply weren't being mentored, as those who could do the mentoring were leaving too quickly. This was a problem that, had it been the sole problem, could have been easily overcome with just allowing the new staff some time to catch up. But then the next much bigger problem arrived. Corruption. South Africa had been going through a golden age. It was a global icon of racial repair, it was the economic powerhouse of the African continent, and it even had good weather. Unfortunately, there was still a lot of racial tensions seething below the surface, and this opened the door to populist politics. People could get into positions of power through campaigning on promises to resolve real or imagined racial imbalances, rather than through demonstrating actual leadership skills. This opened the door to those who were just clawing their way in to essentially skim money, and an entire network of corruption riddled the entire infrastructure. The most popular form was what was called tenderpreneurship. The government offered tenders for companies to apply some sort of need, and somehow friends of government officials seemed to succeed over those who actually offered a quality service. The corrupt people in charge obviously didn't want anyone looking too closely at their decisions, and a really good way to get people to turn a blind eye to your corruption is for you to turn a blind eye to theirs. So the infestation simply spread. All of the state-owned companies suffered terribly under this regime, and Eskom only survived as well as it did due to how healthy it had been in the first place. The maintenance of certain systems simply wasn't done, but was still paid for. Supplies either didn't arrive or were far lower in quality than was promised, or were simply wrong. Coal was a big factor here. Good quality coal was paid for and even inspected at the source, but the coal that arrived was much lower quality and sometimes even had rocks mixed in to increase the weight. So now Eskom was very unhealthy. But who could you complain to? Who could you trust to not be part of the corrupted infrastructure? On top of it all, there were external issues. The big one was the issues with income. For the most part, Eskom sold its power to the various municipalities, who then sold it on to the end users and collected the payments. Unfortunately, the money was then used by the municipalities for other purposes, or simply stolen through other corruption endeavours, and never made its way back to Eskom. Money meant that even the real maintenance couldn't happen. And then there was external crime. The very popular criminal endeavour was to simply steal power lines and either sell the cable to scrap metal merchants or, through the occasional convoluted process, sell it back to Eskom. Another was to simply steal electricity, connecting to the grid and bypassing any sort of meter for entire communities who didn't want to pay. Attempting to make the mostly disadvantaged communities pay would be met by accusations of racial discrimination and of being against the transformation of South Africa. And then the cherry on top were the things that Eskom was trying to do but now couldn't do due to the heavy infestation of corruption. Things like trying to expand into disadvantaged areas and to increase generation to match projected growth. All of that took expertise and money, which simply wasn't available. But years have passed and people know about all of this. Why isn't it fixed? The first terrible reason is that it's politically humiliating. Admitting to the causes of Eskom's issues is basically admitting to corruption and flaws in the main political party, and they can't have that. There is also a big problem with unions in the powerful coal industry. Many of the plans to fix things would affect the incomes of these entities, and they of course fought that aggressively. The biggest issue is obviously money. Eskom is trying to increase electricity prices, but entities that protect the end users are preventing that, which puts Eskom between a rock and a hard place, basically between the coal and union and corrupt group interests and political pressures. An iconic example here was the attempt to build new power plants. It started with a corrupt deal to try and purchase a new nuclear plant from Russia, but that fortunately got stymied. Two large coal plants were planned instead, and their construction was riddled with corruption and massive cost ballooning and time overruns, to nobody's surprise, really. So that's the cautionary tale. Essentially, be very wary of populist politics because it is very effective camouflage for all sorts of evil enterprises in places you really don't expect to see them. But there are glimmers of light ahead. Firstly, Eskom is being broken up into three entities: power generation, power transmission, and power distribution. This will hopefully simplify the processes in each entity to make it harder to hide corruption. The door has been widened for what are called independent power providers, basically private companies that are now allowed to connect plants to the grid that supply up to 100 megawatts each. This has really opened the door to renewables and more efficient processes. Increasing experience by the newer staff at Eskom has improved maintenance efforts and general management efforts, now that they have more public support. And finally, the actual corruption itself has become a major political point of contention, damaging the prospects of the leading party. So it's being fought more aggressively, for the most part. The party itself was part of the problem, and fighting corruption is always a game of expert-level whack-a-mole, but at least there's some progress. So it's not all doom and gloom. Anyway, I hope that was all interesting and maybe even helpful. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments, like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and I hope to see you in the next video.